Really what the exercise is all about here is the image of the ship ploughing its way through a long drifting swell, and it's so typical of the Mersey on a grey day like this. But as I've had to use an old fairly blurred photo of the ship, I've simplified quite a lot of the details. Right, now I'm using 5 colours here: Payne's Grey, Raw Sienna, Light Red, Burnt Umber and Ultramarine. But to be honest, most of the picture is going to be painted in ultramarine blue and burnt umber, and that's going to create that grey overcast effect and the steely colour in the water. Right, now although we want a long swell, what I've got to watch out for is not to make these waves too steep, because even in a heavy swell like this, you've got to paint with a little bit of restraint and keep the waves actually a bit flatter than you might think you need them. Right, now I've put a wash of clean water in the sky because I want everything blended in the sky and running together. What I don't really want is any white patches that's going to give an impression or an atmosphere of bright sunlight, because to be honest, it isn't that sort of day I'm trying to create. Right, next thing is to put a very, very pale wash of raw sienna on the horizon. It's just really to warm it up slightly. Don't forget, it's a cool day, not a freezing cold day. Now for the clouds themselves, basically I've got a mix of ultramarine blue and Payne's Grey, and as you can see, I'm streaking it across the sky. It's a bit darker in both corners, just to push the viewer's eye in towards the centre of the picture. Right, now here I'm putting in the dock walls and the buildings, the dock sheds, the cranes and so on, in pretty well the same colour as in the sky in that top right hand corner. Right, now it's only a very, very loose impression this, because really it's pushing the docks back in the distance, and that all helps to place the boat in the centre of the river at the mouth of the Mersey. Right, now, and while I'm busy yapping, I'm also putting in a lighter wash of the same colour as horizontal streaks in the distant part of the water. That's going to dry off very, very light afterwards, but it just does enough to lose the white of the paper. Right, now as we get closer to the ship, I'm doing a very, very slightly stronger mix, this time with ultramarine and burnt umber. Now as we get round this side of the ship, you can see I'm starting to follow the lines of the waves. Right, now this is important. I'm filling in each wave with this colour, maybe a touch darker here and there, but it's all going to go very, very pale when it dries. What this will do is to form a light underwash when we come to add detail later, but painting each wave is much better than swilling a flat wash of this colour straight across the whole area. Right, now I'm still varying the colours ever so slightly. There's a little touch of raw sienna, for example, just gone in front of the bows of the ship. Right, now when the top layers go on for the waves, this pale underwash will show through very effectively and much more subtly than if we'd have left the paper stark white. Now what I'm going to do, before I start painting any more detail in these waves, is to paint the boat. The reason being that I want to see the strength of the boat before I paint the foreground waves, because at the end of the day, these waves are here to support the focal point of the picture, which is the boat, not necessarily the other way around. So to paint the waves now to final detail, and I painted them too strongly or in too much detail, then that's going to compete with the boat for attention, and it's not going to be as good a picture. Right, the first thing we're going to have to do is to guess the colour of the area below the wheelhouse. I think the wheelhouse top part here is white, but I rather think that this area here below that would be, in those days, a sort of a varnished wood of some sort. So I'm just painting some of this in a sort of a fairly nondescript burnt umber colour. It's quite light in fact, but it'll help me to just get some shapes painted on the rest of the side of the ship there. Now for the side of the ship here, the black area, in fact we're going to do quite a light grey on the top surface there, because that is going to catch the light, and it also gives me a chance to introduce some rust streaks which will really give the ship a degree of authenticity. There's actually a rubbing plate here, which is that line, which is why these tyres are dangling, I assume, from the side of the ship. So when it comes into port and sidles up to the quayside, it's the rubber tyres that's going to take the impact and not the side of the ship. But that's actually angled inwards and downwards, so we'll paint that much darker black, umber and ultramarine blue. I could use a Payne's Grey on its own, but it's a little bit flat I think for this, and I want to introduce a little bit of variety of the colour. So I'm painting that here. It'll actually be quite light when it dries off. Now I'm putting a tiny little bit of light red in this just to give a little impression maybe of a little bit of rust where cargo is loaded and unloaded and is clattered against the side of the boat, and certainly where the anchor is raised and lowered. Notice I'm only painting down to the plimsoll line, as it's called. That's the red line that indicates how low the ship is sitting in the water. Underneath here is a much darker colour because it curves right underneath the boat. So I don't think there's many freighters that don't have that sort of rust all over their hull. Now there's a little white line sits on the line of the plimsoll line. I've reserved that with masking fluid, so I'm not worried about having to paint over that. Now you can see that the swell is really helping to expose some of that red area below the plimsoll line. Right, now having lifted a little streak of light out of the funnel, I've actually gone back with some slightly darker colour either side, which helps to emphasise that light streak. I've rubbed all of the masking fluid off the boat and filled in some of the lights and darks where appropriate, except I haven't taken the masking fluid off at the bow wave here or at the bit of the foam that's coming out of the stern from the engines. I'll save that till after I've painted the water. To represent the curves at the stern here and this bit of a stern that sort of sticks out, and then the counter stern that runs underneath like that, that's much darker because it really is in shadow, whereas this part here is catching the highlight, and this part here just behind where the bows start coming together is also a bit that tends to catch the light. So I've represented that by just streaking downwards again with clean water and then just gently blotting out. Right, now I've got another very thin watery wash. You can see how watery that is because all I'm doing is staining the top layer of the water. I don't want it too dark at this stage, but that double layer of colour, however pale it is on the palette, will help to give us the necessary definition. And you can see I've started here, I've just lightly dragged and dry brushed some streaks of that darker colour in the far distant part of the water, which is really just going to be flat streaks at the moment. We don't want that showing as too rough, because if it's rough far away it'll be mountainous when we get into the foreground.